Spa is always a track full of exhilarating moments. Well, if you forget that one time, of course. This weekend was no exception, but it had presented us with a different race dynamic than what we are normally used to. Without further ado, please sit back, grab a cup of comforting beverage of your choice, and allow me to attempt to untangle this weekend for you. As always, let's start with the news. Ocon was announced to continue with Haas from 2025 onwards. Not very surprising. I think a lot of us knew that this was going to happen. More on the surprising end of things was Mattia Binotto's announcement to lead the Audi project as Chief Operating Officer and Chief Technological Officer. Many will be very happy to see his return. Sadly, but also expectedly, Bruno Femin's departure was announced at Alpine. We don't know who will be replacing him yet, but bets are on Oliver Oaks at the moment. And some track-specific updates were Verstappen's 10 grid place penalty and Tsunoda's 60 place grid penalty after engine changes. Now let's go over to the track. Spa is the longest track on the calendar with 44 laps. However, it is a very high-speed circuit. Sector 1 and Sector 3 require a lot of straight line speed, while Sector 2 is more about cornering speed. There have been important changes added to the circuit. For example, the Camel Straight has been shortened. The reason for that? Because it was too easy to overtake here in the past. Remember this one here because, well, it had its impact. If you're wondering about the tires, Pirelli brought that mid-range compound package with C2, C3 and C4 tires being used during the race. In terms of circuit-specific updates, the majority of teams brought a lower downforce setup, meaning offload on rear and front wings and beam wings. Some of the teams were trying to compensate for that in terms of their floor, so you could see, especially in the first free practice, that plenty of teams were bouncing a little bit, and that is because of that low floor height. That brings me to Mercedes, who have originally changed their diffuser and added that floor edge flap, again to have a bit more grounding, but then they decided to discard that for the race because they realized that that would hinder them during the race. They did not have good simulations and the tires degraded a lot during free practices. While everyone was trying to get their thinnest wings out, look at the Alpine's sick livery, by the way, or McLaren's RB, etc., we had Red Bull. Red Bull brought 2 wing specifications. Throughout the entirety of the weekend, Perez was running with a more loaded wing, and Verstappen changed that between free practice 1 and free practice 2. On the first free practice, he was running with the higher downforce setup, which meant that he was ahead of everybody in terms of 1 lap pace, and that is because he had a superior cornering speed. During the second free practice, his rear wings were severely chopped, and therefore his pace was a lot more similar to the McLaren's, meaning that during the second sector, he lost that advantage and he had better straight line speed. But in conclusion, Verstappen felt a lot better with the higher downforce setup. Now allow me to clarify this high downforce, low downforce thing and who is right, who is wrong. This circuit has long straight lines, so overtaking normally happens there. You do want a lower downforce setup because otherwise you can get stuck behind somebody else and you would not be able to overtake them. That is why a lot of teams compromise their pace during quali, because for quali, you would want that higher downforce in the middle sector to optimize your lap. But that would mean that you would get compromised during the race, and obviously the race is more important. In the past, we have seen McLaren fumbling with their setup. Last year, they brought a very high downforce rear wing, so they could not overtake in the straight line. And why is that Verstappen ended up electing the higher downforce rear wing? Not only him, but Perez was also running with that more loaded rear throughout the entirety of the weekend. It's an interesting question because you would think that with his grid place penalty, he would aim to have a superior straight line speed so that he could comb through the field. But apparently he was not feeling comfortable with that setup and his tire degradation was also lower. The other thing is that with a bigger rear wing, you can have a more significant DRS gain. So a higher downforce setup can be costly during the race, but if your aero setup is good, then it may be a good choice at the end of the day. The first 2 free practices were dry, while Saturday was all rainy. This meant that all the setup changes that teams were opting for after the first 2 free practices could not be tested during the last free practice under dry conditions. And as a result, most teams were a little bit blindfolded when it came to the race. Let's get to the quality session. Track temperatures were about 22 degrees Celsius. It wasn't raining heavily. Sometimes it was not raining at all during the quali session, and other times there was some light drizzling that really did not compromise anybody's lap times. Another thing to note here is that the track could be very slippery. Curbs can store a lot of extra water, which means that sliding is a bit more typical under the circumstances. Because again, teams are focusing on the race with their setup. A very low downforce package is not easy to drive with when the track is wet. Let's cover Q1. The Haas drivers were unfortunately out. That is because they had a good straight line speed. In the second sector though, they were losing about 7 to 8 tenths to Stroll. Tsunoda didn't really risk anything. Of course, with his grid penalty, he wasn't aiming for the best lap times here. And Sargent's lap was very much compromised. First of all, he had to let a lot of cars through for his final lap, so his outlet was not optimal. And second of all, he went too wide into La Source, at which point Verstappen actually overtook him, and then Sargent was stuck behind Verstappen, who was impeded by Joe at one point. And because of these shenanigans, he did not have a chance to get to Q2. Now about Q2, Albon lost out by 0.003 of a second behind Perez, which is of course sad for Albon, but what a luck for Perez to continue. Gasly clearly did not have the same straight line speed as Ocon. He was way slower in the first sector, although he was then faster in the second, so my suspicion is that they were running with different setups during the quali and of course consequently during the race as well. Ricciardo set his final lap a bit too early, so he missed out on track evolution, while in terms of Stroll, he was not really improving under the conditions. He had 2 push laps actually at the end, and none of those worked really well. During the last session, we saw 2 different types of strategies. Mercedes and McLaren elected to stay out the whole time, which meant that they had to keep their tire wear and temperatures in an optimal window, which compromised both of their push laps. Seeing how Hamilton was third at the end with Verstappen's grid penalty, he was clearly maximizing his opportunities on those tires because staying out was not the right choice. When you look at Ferrari and Red Bull, they pushed for 1 lap, went to pit, and then they came back with a new set of tires and they pushed again. More on that too, that Verstappen had an absolute superior pace in the second sector. That is how he actually won that quali session by almost 6 tenths ahead of Leclerc, but Ferrari's low floor height gave them a bit more downforce, and I think it helped Leclerc to clinch that second place, which was converted to pole at the end. Sainz made a mistake in the first sector, so he could not improve, while Russell was a lot slower than Hamilton in sectors 2 and 3. I wanted to dedicate these few seconds to show you this picture. Look at that happy bunny, as if his soul had not been destroyed so many times. Let's talk about the race, because what a race we had. At the start, Norris lost 3 positions when he went way too wide in turn 1. That compromised the rest of his race, of course. Hamilton was rapid. He overtook Perez and then finally overtook Leclerc, and that had a big significance for him because he was able to drive in clean air, and clean air, as we know, is king. Verstappen got through Albon and Alonso quickly, but once he reached Norris territory, he couldn't really do much. He was stuck in that DRS train that I'm gonna talk about more. You know I love to talk about strategies. My mind was buzzing the whole time. I was trying to figure out who did what. So here's my best attempt. There are 2 main directions that teams went for. There is a one-stop choice that was elected by Russell, but contrary to popular belief, not only by him, but by Stroll and Alonso, Tsunoda, and Magnussen, who were all gaining a lot with this strategy. So strategy of the day, undoubtedly a one-stop. And there is a 2-stop direction where we have 3 main groups. One is what the Williams drivers and Perez elected, to go for the mediums twice and then go on a longer stint on the hards. It was absolutely not a good one. The most typical choice was to go for mediums first and then continue on hards twice. And here you can see that Leclerc and Hamilton elected an almost identical strategy. They pitted almost at the same time. Piastri and Ocon, they had fresher tires at the end. Ocon could climb through the field, but was slightly compromised by all the undercuts that he had to battle through. And we saw that with Piastri. I'm going to talk about him separately as well, that it wasn't so easy with those fresh tires towards the end. And as the last 2-stop group, I have to talk about Verstappen and Bottas and Hülkenberg, who went for the mediums first, then changed to hards, and then returned to mediums again. This generally wasn't a good or a bad strategy. I think it would have looked way worse had it been for some Verstappen Heroics keeping Norris behind, because the degradation on mediums was very significant. To deep dive into these strategies a little bit more, I'm going to talk about Russell versus Hamilton versus Verstappen first. On his first stint, Hamilton was much faster than both Russell and Verstappen. The reason being is that Hamilton was driving in clean air at the time, while Russell was stuck in that DRS train behind Piastri, so was Verstappen at the time. We have to look at this bit here where Verstappen and Russell pitted at the same time. So this proves that if Verstappen elected to go on the hards till the end of the race, he would have had the chance to win this GP. Absolute masterclass from Russell and Mercedes to go with this choice, because it was a bold one. Normally in Spa, a faster car means an easy overtake, but because of that camel straight being shortened and all the cars being really close to one another, a faster tire compound did not translate to an easy overtake or an overtake at all. On this chart towards the end, you can see that Russell was able to evolve more and more. He had only a slight drag. His pace was absolutely astonishing. Why wasn't Hamilton able to overtake him? Now that's because Hamilton thought that Russell was going to pit. He saved his tires for a bit. He was not significantly faster than him on purpose. Towards the end, he realized that he had to push to overtake. He was about 7 to 8 tenths quicker than Russell, but by the time he reached him, there was just a few laps for him to finish his attempt, and alas for Hamilton, he did not succeed. Russell won the GP on track, but a few hours later came the news that his car was underweight after being drained of fuel by about 1.5 kilograms. Why could this be? Well, first of all, he had a very long stint on the hard tires, so his tire wear was massive, which of course reduces the weight of the car overall. But then you could point out that Stroll and Alonso were on identical strategies to Russell. Why didn't they have this issue? Well, it could be many things. As I said, teams did not really know what to expect during a dry session because the last free practice was fully wet. So there could be a setup issue. It is also true that towards the end, because he had to fight Hamilton up until the finish line, he could not collect rubber on his tires, which normally adds a little bit of weight. The sad news, but being underweight, 100% translates to disqualification. This also means that Hamilton inherited the win. But before I talk about the conclusions, there are so many other strategical elements to unpack. First of all, what went wrong with Norris? As I said, on his first lap, he lost a few positions, ultimately a driver error, and then on his first stint, he was stuck behind Sainz, and his tires were actually degrading a bit more than on the Mercedes, as I could see. Similar degradation to Verstappen, I would say. That's precisely why I don't understand why McLaren decided to keep him on track for 15 laps. His degradation wasn't looking great. Verstappen used that opportunity to undercut him for their second stint, which meant that Norris was stuck behind him at the time. Actually, when Norris came out of the pits, he was about 6 seconds away from Max. So first of all, he had to eliminate that gap, and then he tried to overtake Max, which was impossible because, again, these DRS trains made it extremely difficult for anybody to overtake. You had to have seconds of an advantage on a lap to be able to do that. His last stint was of a similar length as Verstappen's. Difference is that he was running on the hards while Verstappen was running on mediums. And on paper, he should have had the advantage, which he did to some extent because degradation on mediums, as I said before, was substantial. And that is why I think it was some kind of Verstappen miracle to keep him behind the whole time. Norris was very, very close towards the end. Maybe if they had like 2 more laps to go, the Briton could have overtaken Verstappen. We will not know, but commendable job from Verstappen's side for sure. Bad strategy calls for McLaren, and of course a driver mistake at the beginning did not really help. That brings me to his teammate Oscar Piastri. He had a good start, he also had a good pace. He had a longer second stint than Leclerc, but once Leclerc was out of the picture, as the Monegasque driver pitted earlier than Piastri, Piastri could drive in clean air, which was doing him a lot of favors at the time, so even with those fresh new tires, Leclerc was not really catching him. The unfortunate situation came when Piastri went into the pit lane, his braking being a bit too late. So again, an unfortunate car position for him, which meant that he had a longer pit stop than ideal. It was around 4.4 seconds, which means that he lost about 2 seconds. With those 2 seconds lost in a pit, Piastri had to catch up to Leclerc first, and it took him about 5 laps to overtake him. So he lost some time there. By the time he caught up to that Russell Hamilton pack, it was a little bit too late, but it's that could have, should have, would have situation. The potential was there. He was the fastest man on track during the race, but that did not grant him a victory at the end. I want to mention Leclerc a little bit. He did the best that he could. His strategy was fine, actually. But when I looked at his straight line speed, both through the speed trap and the finish line, he was one of the slowest cars. Hands down, what a performance from him. The tire degradation for Ferrari seemed a little bit heavy, much like it was the case for Perez. Again, for Ferrari, I think it's that grounding or bouncing issue that they have that caused the tire overheating. And when you look at Sainz, he had that reverse strategy that I haven't touched upon before. He started on the hards, went long on them, which meant that Verstappen and Norris undercut him naturally. And then he changed for mediums, but the mediums were degrading a lot. He was only using them for 8 laps, and that was a death sentence for his race. He should have done a reverse Russell strategy, which would have favored him a lot more. And as a last part of race discussions, what happened to Perez? He had a decent qualifying. I did not mention that actually. He was about 6/10 off of his teammate. He did have that high downforce setup, which helped him during the quali session, but definitely didn't do him any favors when it came to tire degradation. First, Hamilton overtook him. Later on, Piastri did that as well, and then Russell too. Going for those mediums twice meant that he had to pit early for his last stint, during which time he lost immense amount of time. He was really not looking great on those hard compounds. Everybody amongst the front runners were about half a second quicker than him, and Verstappen and Norris could catch him easily on fresh tires. And that is how eventually he lost 6 positions. 5 officially with Russell's disqualification, but that is really 6 in reality. So what were my conclusions after the race? I have to highlight the element again, but it was very hard to overtake on a track where overtaking is usually fairly easy. Many saw the downsides of DRS trains not only in the front but also in the back. And strategy did make the difference on Sunday. Much like in Hungary, which is truly unexpected looking at the very different track characteristics. McLaren and Piastri had the best pace overall, but bad strategy calls and driver errors did not help them. Ocon's pace was something else. He was climbing through the field like nobody had been there. I mentioned this before, but I think he was running with a slightly different setup to Gasly's, but it paid off for sure. Now, higher downforce setups were costly, especially for Perez, but it did not make Verstappen's life easy either. The Dutchman maximized what he could. The strategy could have been what Russell opted for, but overall, it wasn't a bad day for Max, considering that he started from 11th and he no longer has that dominant car that could climb to the top in a mere of 10 to 18 laps. When we look at the point structure, Verstappen extended his lead ahead of Norris ever so slightly. Piastri overtook Sainz and is now 10 points behind Leclerc, and overall 32 points behind his teammate. Russell would be ahead of Perez in the Drivers' Championship if it hadn't been for his disqualification. And Stroll has half the points of Alonso, much like it's the case between Tsunoda and Ricciardo at the moment. McLaren and Red Bull are only 42 points away from one another. My driver of the day is going to be separated into 2 parts. Driver of Sunday was Russell. I will not take that away from him. But when I look at the entirety of the weekend, I'd say Hamilton did a better job overall. He did not make any mistakes during quali or the race. He was given a different strategy. I will emphasize Leclerc, who was one of my favorites during this weekend. With a clear 4th best car, he maximized everything that he could. And I will also mention Verstappen because he did not make any mistakes during the weekend. His strategy could have been better, which wasn't really up to him. So yeah, good job from Max. But again, what do you think? Have I missed anyone? Anything? I know I did not mention Joe's DNF. It went very quietly. It's not like he had chances during this race anyways. Overall, many thanks for watching this video. What a first half of a season we had. And so many interesting circuits are coming this year that I cannot wait to delve into.